Now you spoke to how paradoxical this work can be.
Yeah, yeah.
um, can we talk more about that? Because I feel like for some people it could be very confusing, or they will possibly say, well, you know, it's conflicting, things like that. Can you explain that some more?
Oh, how do I explain it? Okay, well, I feel like I'm just kind of, I'll reiterate what I said before, but let's give it a shot. The reality that people believe they're experiencing here is polarized. What that means is for every one concept, there is an equal and opposing concept to balance it,
Mhm.
right? So light and dark would be polarized concepts. And this entire outpicturing of consciousness is based on that principle, okay? Its source comes from the belief that consciousness could be separate from that which it is, okay? Meaning that your sense of self could be separate from God. And that belief set up a dynamic that consciousness fell into and is currently enslaved by, where it believes that that's real, that I can be separate from God. And that's not a conscious aspect. That's very much unconscious. But it created a whole paradigm where everything here occurs in opposites. Okay, so let's set that aside. Call that 3D. Now let's jump up to what I'm just going to term the illumined worlds. The illumined worlds would be any level of reality occurring outside of third dimensional consciousness or outside of polarized consciousness. In the illumined worlds, consciousness is not polarized. What that means from a mental perspective is just that even though you are individuated in your energetic construct, right, as an aspect or as a drop in the sea of consciousness that is God, you are individuated in that. However, you are not separate from any other aspect or any other drop in that ocean. It's all one large drop where, if you look at a wave crashing and a spray of water, it seems as though there are individual drops, but then as soon as they fall, they merge back with the ocean and you can't tell one from the other. So at that level of consciousness, that's what is true. That is all that is true. At that level of consciousness, polarization does not exist. It does not exist. So even the concept can't be brought forward. Okay, the concept of evil does not exist at that plane of consciousness. Does not. The concept that we would have here, that people are out to get you, or that there's a boogeyman, or that people are greedy and selfish, and like none of that exists in that plane of consciousness. And there's a large void that exists between those planes of consciousness and the third dimensional plane, because it's meant as a buffer zone so that consciousness at this level cannot somehow seep into what we would say the higher levels of reality. And so within that, now we have the issue of paradox. And that comes because we're trying to bring understandings of reality that exists outside of polarity into the realm of polarity, and to try to bring them from a space that, words can't describe it, but all we have here are words, right? We aren't functioning from a level of, telepathic imagery where symbols are used versus, communicating through polarized language. And that's what's going on. So the teacher has to use polarized language to try to point to an experience that happens outside of the reality that the language is coming out of, you see, and it makes it very challenging. So in order to navigate this path, you have to get comfortable with the idea that paradox is a normal and necessary part of the journey home. And because it has to be, and you have to get comfortable with that. See, the mind itself, the lower mind, that is the part of you that you think of as your ego or your sense of your personal self, can only really think in terms of polarity, right? It thinks in terms of right and wrong. And what it doesn't see, and the way that Vivekananda described it once, and I thought it was just so brilliant, was he described consciousness in terms of a sliding scale, where all of it exists on this scale. And the question is just, where are you at any given moment on that scale of consciousness? It's beautiful because it just shows it's all on a continuum, that there's nothing separate. But down in this reality, what we experience is the mind that believes there is right and wrong, and there is good and bad, and there is up and down. And it thinks in terms of these highly polarized things. Just like, you're looking currently at the U.S. political system, right, where you have far right wing and far left wing, and very few centrists in the middle who can actually move and navigate both directions, because they're so locked into how they view the world that there's no wiggle room, right? So within that's where all the paradox occurs, because you can look at something and see it this way, and because your mind is trained to see from a level of polarized consciousness, all you'll see is through the filter of that polarization. And it keeps you from being capable of seeing the reality that's sitting right underneath it, right? And that's where it all exists. The paradox is that you aren't even seeing what's real, right? Because you see through a filter. And coming out of polarized consciousness into the reality that you are, right? The true witness that you are, there's no filter in place at all. So one views the world without a filter and sees everything very clearly as it is. But that also means that there's nothing that identifies any of it, because the only place the identification occurs is within the lower mind, right? So the difference between a person living in the world who hasn't, whose consciousness is locked in, and the person living in the world who has moved beyond that level of consciousness is, one is stuck here because they are hell-bent on making sure that their reality continues to follow the construct that they have been taught it should and continue to believe it should. And then the individual who just sees clearly, right? And isn't identified with any of it and isn't attached to any of it. It's all transient. It sees it for what it is, a movement of consciousness, a constantly moving out picturing of consciousness that has no reality, in highest truth. So does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that definitely does.